In 1955, the average American man could walk into a factory, get hired on the spot, and earn enough to buy a house, feed a family of 4, and put gas in a Chevy Bel Air. One income, one job, no college degree required. However, that version of manhood, the one that built the suburbs and won the Cold War, did not just disappear on its own. So what dismantled it? And was it ever as solid as we remember? It was 1950, and the United States was a country remade by war. Over 16 million men had served in World War II, and now they were home, flooding into cities and small towns from coast to coast, with government-backed checks in their pockets and a hunger for the ordinary life they had been promised. The economy was waiting for them. Manufacturing employed 30% of the American workforce that year. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Milwaukee ran 3 shifts around the clock, producing steel, automobiles, appliances, and aircraft parts. A young man fresh out of the Army could walk onto the floor at a General Motors plant in Flint, Michigan, and within a few weeks he was pulling down a paycheck large enough to support a wife and a child on the way. The GI Bill made the rest of it possible. Formerly called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, it offered returning veterans something almost unheard of at the time: federally guaranteed home loans with no money down and low monthly payments. Before the bill, homeownership was out of reach for a large portion of working Americans. After it, builders like William Levitt turned potato fields on Long Island into entire planned communities. Levittown, New York became the template. Rows of modest Cape Cod houses stretched across former farmland, each one affordable on a factory worker's salary. By the end of the decade, home ownership in America had climbed past 60%, and the price-to-income ratio for a house sat at roughly 2 to 1. 2 years of household income could buy you a home. For context, that ratio today is closer to 6. What did a man do with all that economic power? The expectations that came with all of this were clear, almost mathematical in their simplicity. A man worked, a woman kept the home, and children obeyed. 65% of American kids during that decade grew up in a household with a breadwinner father and a stay-at-home mother who were married to each other. That structure was not optional. In many white-collar companies, a man without a wife could lose a promotion because employers saw an unmarried man as unstable or suspect. Sociologist Robert Brannon later outlined the unwritten code in what he called the blueprint of manhood, which boiled down to 4 rules. No sissy stuff meant avoid anything feminine and show no weakness. The big wheel meant seek success, status, and respect in everything. The sturdy oak meant stay calm, stay tough, never break down. And give 'em hell meant take risks and project fearlessness. These were not suggestions. They were survival instructions for a world that had no patience for softness. But there was another force shaping these men that rarely gets mentioned in nostalgia videos: military service. The Korean War broke out in June of 1950, and between then and the summer of 1953, over 1.5 million American men were drafted. Even after the armistice, a peacetime draft continued through the late 1950s and into the 60s. Elvis Presley was drafted in 1957. Willie Mays was called up during the Korean War itself. For an entire generation, military service was not a career choice. It was a near certainty. By 1980, 18% of all American adults were veterans. That shared experience of boot camp, of hierarchy, of physical hardship, created a common language among men that bled into civilian life. You did not complain about your job after you had dug foxholes in freezing Korean mud. You did not argue about mowing the lawn after you had spent 2 years following orders from a drill sergeant at Fort Benning. And the communities these men returned to reinforced all of it. Churches held men's breakfasts on Saturday mornings. The Elks Lodge, the VFW Hall, the Rotary Club, the local bowling league, these were not hobbies. That was the infrastructure of male social life. Men gathered in physical spaces face to face, week after week. They knew their neighbors. They borrowed each other's tools. When someone's roof needed fixing, 4 guys showed up without being asked, because that was the deal. This is where the nostalgia usually stops. The strong provider, the quiet protector, the man who built his own deck and changed his own oil. And all of that existed. But here is the detail that everyone misses when they look back at that era. Even in the 1950s, people were already worried that masculinity was in crisis. In 1950, sociologist David Reisman published The Lonely Crowd, one of the most influential books of the decade. It argued that American men were becoming conformists, losing their inner directed sense of purpose and replacing it with anxious approval seeking. The book sold over 1 million copies. It hit a nerve because men recognized themselves in it. The gray flannel commuter who went along to get along and quietly wondered what it was all for. Sloan Wilson made that anxiety into fiction with The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit in 1955. The novel followed a World War II veteran who returned home, got a corporate job, and slowly suffocated under the weight of a life that looked perfect from the outside and felt hollow from the inside. It became a bestseller, and then a movie starring Gregory Peck, because millions of men understood exactly what Wilson was describing. And then there was Arthur Schlesinger Jr., the Harvard historian, who would go on to advise President Kennedy. In 1958, he wrote a piece for Esquire magazine asking bluntly, "What has happened to the American male?" He argued that for a long time, American men had seemed confident in their manhood, but now a creeping uncertainty about identity was setting in. The self-made man was being replaced by the organization man, and nobody was sure what that meant. If you have been watching carefully, you might notice something. The exact same conversation we are having now about masculinity in crisis, they were having it then, in real time, while the men in question were buying Levittown houses and coaching Little League. The difference was not that men in the 1950s felt more secure in who they were. The difference was that the economy, the draft, the social structure, and the community institutions all conspired to give them a clear script to follow, even when they privately doubted it. If you're finding value in this, consider subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, the kind of history that explains why the present feels the way it does. So what changed, and why doesn't the script work anymore? Start with the jobs. At the start of the decade, 3 out of every 10 American workers built something with their hands. By 2020, that number had dropped to fewer than 1 in 12. Manufacturing employment fell from over 13 million to around 12 million, while the total workforce more than tripled. The factories in Flint, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland either automated, relocated overseas, or closed entirely. The kind of job where a man could walk in without a degree, earn a living wage, and stay for 30 years became the exception, not the rule. But the factory floor was only part of the story. Then the family structure shifted. Today, only 7% of American families match the post-war model of a breadwinner father and a homemaker mother. Only 22% of children grow up in that arrangement now, compared to 65% then. Women entered the workforce in large numbers starting in the 1970s, not only because of the women's movement, but because home prices and college tuition were rising faster than wages. One income stopped being enough. The provider role, the centerpiece of post-war masculine identity, became economically impossible for many men to fulfill alone. How do you build an identity around providing when the economy won't let you provide? And that wasn't even the biggest loss. The military draft ended in 1973, and with it, the shared rite of passage that had bonded an entire generation of American men disappeared almost overnight. Military service went from something nearly every young man experienced to something chosen by a small percentage of the population. The veterans' share of the adult population dropped from 18% in 1980 to 6% by 2022. Without that common thread, one of the strongest bonds between men across class lines and geography simply evaporated. A stockbroker and a plumber had once shared the memory of basic training at Fort Dix or Camp Pendleton. Now they shared nothing. Then the community institutions followed. Church attendance declined. The Elks Lodge lost members, and bowling leagues shrank. Robert Putnam documented the whole collapse in bowling alone in 2000, showing that Americans were withdrawing from the voluntary associations that had once defined civic life. Men lost not just the spaces where they gathered, but the rituals that gave their weeks structure and their friendships context. The Saturday morning breakfast at the church hall, the Wednesday night bowling league, the post-meeting handshake at the VFW, gone or hanging on by a thread. But what replaced those spaces was worse than nothing. What filled the vacuum was a screen. By 2024, a study found that 15% of American men reported having no close friends at all, up from 3% in 1990. 27% said they had no one they could rely on in a crisis. Men's suicide rates held steady at roughly 3 times the rate of women's across all age groups. And a growing number of young men found themselves stuck in a paradox. Raised on stories of grandfathers who built houses and won wars, living in an economy where a single income barely covers rent, let alone a mortgage and a family. The internet offered substitutes, but most of them were hollow. Online communities promised belonging, but they could not replicate the weight of a neighbor helping you re-roof your garage on a Saturday afternoon in July. Podcasters and influencers sold versions of masculinity, some thoughtful, others cartoonish, but none of them could hand a young man a union card and a path to the middle class. So where does that leave the conversation? The men of that era were not made of different material. No one carried a gene for toughness that later generations lost. A specific set of forces shaped them: a booming industrial economy, a military draft, affordable housing, and a social contract that told them exactly who to be and punished them if they deviated. Some of those forces built genuine strength, the ability to endure, to provide, to show up. Others demanded a silence that followed men into old age, into divorce, into hospital rooms where they refused to admit anything was wrong. The question worth sitting with is not whether men in the 50s were more masculine. It is whether the world they lived in made masculinity easier to perform, and whether the world we have built since has made it harder to feel like a man without a script to follow. We explored a similar story about post-war American life and how it shaped a generation in ways most people never learned in school. If that sounds like something worth your time, the video is ready when you are.